One of the things I've learned as I've done this longer and longer is if you do not care about your profit margin, you will not be able to sell your practice. And if you do not care about your profit margin, you will not be able to pay your employees what you want.
Good day, everybody. I am Dr. Bonnie Bragdon. I'm your host today of the Veterinary Insider, the podcast for veterinarians and others who want to keep veterinary medicine independent and veterinarian owned and real and authentic and genuine. I'm so excited to have Dr. Beth Davidow here today because she is definitely the real. Today's podcast is sponsored by the Independent Veterinary Practitioners Association. Check us out at iveterinarians.org. I especially like our benefits of teleradiology service, which is independent radiologists serving the needs of independent clinicians. And with that, we'll get started. So, Dr. Beth, I know you and I have had conversations for quite some time. Goes to show how old we really are. But let's just start at the beginning. So, I always like to know, what inspired you to become a veterinarian?
Well, I'm like one of those crazy people. I've wanted to be a vet basically my whole life. I did a report on raccoons in second grade and said I want to do something with animals. And my mom said, you should be a veterinarian. And I said, okay. And that's sort of what I wanted to do since I was 7 years old. So had some times where I thought maybe I'd do something else, but this has really been always what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I talked to a priest once, and I actually said, being a veterinarian is very much like being, a priest or another religious leader, in that it is a calling. And if you can't imagine doing anything else but being a veterinarian, then being a veterinarian is definitely for you. So, but what I really want our listeners to hear today is your journey and your story. We all learn from each other's stories. And I think there's a lot going on in our profession right now that you have just intense firsthand experiences with. So now you are boarded. So help me understand what that was like, becoming a boarded at you maybe early on, right? So the College of Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care is not really that old.
Yeah, so I have sort of a funny path, and I think one of the beautiful things about veterinary medicine is you can decide you wanted to do it one way and then you end up doing it another way. I really thought I was going to be a mixed animal practitioner, thought I was going to live in a small town and take care of everything. Life took me to Seattle, and I came to Seattle without doing an internship, thought I was going to find a mixed animal job, sort of fell into an ER practice. Loved ER. Turns out I'm a total adrenaline junkie. I actually worked ER for about 4 years and then figured out a way. At that time, you could do an alternate track residency. And so I was one of the first residents that did a emergency critical care residency at Dove Lewis Emergency Hospital in Portland. So did it in sort of a unique way that ended up working well, passed my boards in 2002. And at the same time that I was doing my residency, realized that there was this amazing hospital, Dove Lewis, down in Portland, that was 24 hours, really taking care of critical patients. And at the time, there was no 24-hour hospital in Seattle. I was working at an after-hours only hospital, and I had a situation where I had a dog with tetanus that we actually had to put in the car every morning and transport it back to its primary care regular vet, and then it would come back to me in the evening, and it died on the third day in transport. And you just sort of had this moment of like, God, we're Seattle, we're this pretty big city, we should have something better, we've got to be able to do a better job than this. And I ended up meeting, actually through a technician, another woman veterinarian who was also working in an after-hours practice, having similar experiences, going, there's got to be something better. And we started talking, and it took us about 4 years, but we ended up opening our own practice really in total response to this need for there to be better care for pets, and really provide 24-hour care. So that's sort of the starting point of all this.
That is an awesome story. Like, I have never in my entire career seen a case of tetanus, and I'm sure once you see a case of tetanus, you will never forget it.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, it was sort of a crazy thing. And, just this idea of we're not providing the care we really want to for this pet, was really hard. And, that wasn't the only case, like the number of cases. I think this model of after hours ER, that was how we started as a profession. I think many people realized, like, owners don't want to transport animals with pelvic fractures who can't breathe to their regular veterinarian. Primary care veterinarians who have a full day packed of appointments can't deal with a critical patient. And really, these 24-hour hospitals developed because it didn't make any sense to do it a different way. And so everybody was, I think, grateful in these cities where that became a possibility. But you sort of, like, that was in 2000. There was no 24-hour care in Seattle. So it just hasn't been that long how this has all developed.
It is crazy how things have really evolved. Now, for our listeners who may be interested in starting a practice, any kind of practice, or maybe even in the middle of looking at buying or starting, I heard you say it took you 4 years. So tell me about that journey. Like, what took 4 years?
Well, I think there's a lot of things. We ended up with, there were six of us who were going to be owners initially. We were going to do 24-hour specialty. We actually tried to do a build to suit. I think we were trying to do potentially too much with too many people. And so there was who really wants to be involved, what level of involvement, what does it mean to be a partnership? I think things move faster when you're by yourself. They move slower when you're trying to do these things with other people. I would never open a 24-hour hospital by myself. I just think there's so much work with so much stuff that having partners is important. But it took us a while to figure out, like, who was really in, what level of involvement, what's this going to look like. Of the six of us, a bunch of us ended up working together just in a lot of different ways. So the understanding what your goal is, understanding who's going to be partners, what everybody's level of involvement is, that takes a bit of time. Financing took us a long time. We were the first 24-hour hospital in Seattle, and we were two women without a lot of resources. And so people didn't want to take a risk on us. We went to 20 banks before we found financing. So that took a long time. And then, just finding the right real estate, finding the right location. There's just a lot of learning. I would say the fastest I've seen somebody do a startup is about 13 months. And friends of mine did a urgent care recently, and from the time they said we want to go to when they did it was about 13 months. It's hard to do it any faster than that.
You bring up some really good points. So for our listeners who are looking to start or even buy a practice, check out iveterinarians.org. We have some previous episodes of our podcasts with a banker, a loan officer, CPA, a couple of other service providers. So check us out for those resources. And that's just so interesting. Do you think financing has gotten any easier? All right, I'm going to jump the gun. I have to say it. How have things changed when it comes to women lending, opening a practice? Has that changed? Because now you've started your second practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is it's way easier to open a primary care practice than it is to open a 24-hour ER specialty practice from the ground up. They're just like the amount of resources you need is really different. I think in some ways, the banking has gotten more used to loaning to women. And so I think that's a really good thing. I do think we're lucky in that, Bank of America, Live Oak, some of these other lending institutions, they're not only good about giving people money, but certainly in the Northwest, the bankers for Bank of America have gotten very savvy at not only providing you with a loan, but they also provide you with a list of people who can help you. And so some of my friends who have opened practices in this area, have been surprised. They're like, they gave me the name of an architect, of a contractor, of my representatives, of my insurance broker. And so I think one of the things to realize is we are lucky, and there's a whole host of people who support veterinarians who really now realize how important it is for veterinarians to own their own practices and how good it is for all these auxiliaries as well. And so I think some of that is better. I do think that 24 years down the line from when we were trying to get a loan the first time, people also realize how much money people are willing to spend on specialty. And so it's gotten somewhat easier to get loans for specialty. So I think that's there. It's still really expensive. And I think what was easier the second time is just knowing what I could do, what was possible. I had 2 partners. We were able to make a really good business plan, and we had relationships and had a track record from the first time. So in fact, I had a bank I worked with for my first hospital. We approached them, and they're like, oh yeah, we're all in with you. And so that was super nice to have kept those relationships, built those relationships. People are willing to do it with you a second time.
You are really an inspiration, and I've had other veterinarians who are specialists say, I'm a specialist. I require all the special equipment. It costs so much money that I just don't see any way forward for starting or owning a practice because I am a specialist. And so therefore I'm really dependent on having a large hospital and a large support team. What would you tell, other specialists who maybe are on the fence of whether they should stay in a large network with a corporate hospital or whether they should start their own, like pros and cons?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways to do specialty, and it depends a little bit on what your specialty is. One trend that I think is very interesting is when I first moved to Seattle, there were a lot of specialists who were all doing their own thing. They had their own mobile practices or their own standalone facilities. And then when we opened, people saw, well, there's some advantage to everybody being together and working together and having one practice. The problem with these big specialty hospitals where it's one ownership group is it's really hard to buy them out. And that's why, 90% of specialty medicine is now owned by corporations and private equity and all these groups is because I put my house on the line, I borrowed from my family, like all of those things. And then you own something that's super valuable. Somebody can't come, a veterinarian, like I couldn't have bought myself out, right? Myself at 25 couldn't buy myself at 40 out. And so that's what makes it really tricky. But what's happened, and I think is really interesting, is we're going back a little bit to where we were before, and that specialists have said, yes, I can work in this beautiful Taj Mahal. I can have all the things I want equipment-wise, but fundamentally, my basic needs about my values around practice are not always being met. And so they're leaving and starting mobile practices again or starting small single specialty practices. Now, is that good for pets and clients? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Is it good for individuals, and is it possible? Absolutely. So it means that if I'm a cardiologist and I don't want to work for a big practice, it's going to be really hard when you first start out to have your fluoro unit and do interventional, but you can absolutely afford to buy an ultrasound machine and be mobile, save some money, and then build your standalone fluoro unit. Same if you're a surgeon, same if you're other things. If you're a critical care specialist like me, you got to find some partners and you start small and you can absolutely do it. It is definitely possible to own a 24-hour hospital. You just can't have everything when you open the door.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one of the resources I would like our specialty members to know about is VSPA, so the Veterinary Specialty Practice Alliance. And you're a member. You've been a member for some time. So tell me about that.
Actually not. I love VSPA, but I'm not actually a member of them for a number of reasons. But I think there's 2 different groups out there, VSPA and then VMG. And I do think that one of the things that makes it easier to own a practice is if you have friends. and just somebody else to talk to about, this is really hard. How did you handle this? What did you do? What was your approach to this? I think, IVPA, BSPA, VMG, and then also VIN has a ton of great resources for people who are owning practices. Their practice management boards are very, very useful. And then I think just getting to be friends, like who else do you know who's owned a practice? How do you talk to them? We can support each other by having these conversations.
Yeah. And just for our listeners out there, so VIN, Dr. Davidow, you're actually a consultant on VIN. I've seen you respond to quite a number of questions. So you get to talk one-on-one with Dr. Davidow on VIN. IVPA, iveterinarians.org. We are trying to be thought leadership, a little bit more politically motivated and helping to advocate across political channels. VSPA, a lot of benefits. And VMG, of course, is a cooperative for co-veterasts. And so lots of camaraderie and tools and special pricing. So just lots and lots of, it's a great ecosystem that's developing out there of service providers who really want to support independent practices.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right. So let's talk about your exit, right? So you built this lovely practice in Seattle, really learned a lot of things at a time when you were a frontier person and doing it all on your own and doing some of the first things. So tell me, what happened? How did you exit from that? What happened that we're now at a second practice?
Yeah. So my partner and I opened our first practice, and we were very successful, grew our first location very well, and then ended up deciding to open a second location. And so we did open a second practice actually in the middle of the recession, learned a lot about both expansion, multi-location, and also learned about kind of how to grow practices. We ended up along the way, our original goal had always been to sell to our employees. We actually offered buy-in to all of our veterinarians right before we opened our second location. And so we had the practice valued, and we said, this is going to be the best time to buy in because it's the least expensive it's going to be, because we're going to grow when we open the second location. And we offered it to, I think, 6 veterinarians and only hoped to sell 20%. We only sold 6% to 2 veterinarians, and we had a bit of a wake-up call, like, this is going to be really, really hard. People were like, this is really expensive. We think you guys are working really hard. We don't think we want to put up that much risk or work as hard as you guys are. And so they didn't buy in. And so we had only managed to sell 6%. And so that was sort of a like, well, how are we going to get out? My business partner is 14 years older than I am, and she got to the point, we opened these 2 locations. We then outgrew our first location, and so we needed another new location, another loan, another big project. And she was like, I either have to get out now or I'm stuck for another 10 years and I'm right at retirement age. And right at that point, we started getting cold calls from people who wanted to buy us. And this hadn't really happened, I think, in veterinary medicine before this, like, you're worth something, we'd like to own you. And we didn't know what that meant. We started having a lot of conversations. We quickly realized we did not want to sell to private equity for a number of reasons. And I had friends who had worked for Blue Pearl, and we called Blue Pearl and said, are you interested in expanding to the Pacific Northwest? And at that point in time, Blue Pearl was owned by 80 veterinary shareholders. And so what was appealing to us was we can be part of a big group, 25 practices at that point. All the original owners are in. We can have help, advice, camaraderie, and spread our risk, because we would be owners of 25 practices rather than just our own. And it seemed like a really good offer. We liked all the other owners. There were some spectacular practices and people involved in Blue Pearl at that time. And this seemed like a win-win. I could stay in, I could still be an owner, my partner could leave. And so we decided, and we could get a new building, which we needed for the practice. And so we opted to do that. And that was in 2003. or 2013 is when we did it. So we had owned the practice for 10 years. And my total plan was like, I'm in, I'm staying. This is my deal. I'm going to be there. And what we didn't realize is 3 months after we sold, Blue Pearl sold 25% of their practice to private equity, partly because they didn't have an exit strategy for all of their owners who were also turning 60. They didn't have a good way to get everybody out. And in a year and a half from when we bought, they went from 25 to 60 practices and sold to Mars. And so all of a sudden, instead of working with AD veterinary shareholders, which is sort of what my goal had been, I was working for a candy company. And that I stayed a little bit longer, but that was not what I had intended to do. So that was sort of a sign like did not go the way I thought. I was naive. I didn't sort of understand what was happening and decided to do something else. So that was, the end of that. So that was around 2017. I had a very large non-compete because I was an owner. And so I did some gardening. I started a blog. I worked in some primary care practices. I ended up getting a faculty position at WSU, did that for a couple of years. And then my practice that Blue Pearl owned in Seattle was one of the practices that unionized. And the staff that used to work with me actually voted for a union and then spent 4 years in contract negotiations with Blue Pearl that didn't go anywhere. And finally, enough staff left that they closed the practice down. And so all of a sudden, not only do I not own a practice in Seattle, but there's no longer an ER in my neighborhood. So I don't have any place to take my own pets anymore. And one of the vets who had worked with me at Blue Pearl said, I want to move back to Seattle. There's nowhere I want to work. Blue Pearl isn't there anymore. Do you want to open another practice? And so she and I and somebody else she had worked with before got together, and here we are. We're a mile from where my former practice was. So it's a little bit of a crazy story.
It's an awesome story. And I hope our listeners, wherever they are in their own journey, understand how unpredictable life is in a good way and in a bad way, right? Just when you think you're at the depths of never recovering, something happens and things flourish and you end up where you were supposed to be the entire time. So you shared a lot with us, and I'm going to unpack a little bit here, if you will. So first, I think one of the things for our early owners and mid-career owners, and what I mean by that, you're digging in, you're building your practice, you're all excited to, create, decide what PIMs you want and who you want to be your practice manager, and deciding all those day-to-day things. But you bring up a good point, which is you really always have to be thinking about how you're going to exit or leave really early, because the idea is it's not that you want your legacy to continue, but you need to fund your retirement. So tell me, in hindsight, how should owners be planning for exit? What does that look like?
Well, I think it's really tricky. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is if you own a relatively small practice, selling to an associate is a really good exit strategy. And I think one of the things that's happened is the Veterinary Business Management Association, that has lots of chapters for students, has created some very savvy new veterinarians who understand what it means to own practices, and they're interested. Now, up until probably until interest rates went up, the market was such is that if you had owned your practice for 30 years and you had 4 veterinarians working for you, your associates could never pay how much you could get from a private equity firm. It's just the money was different because private equity was willing to pay more than an individual could cash flow your practice. They just couldn't justify the loan. And so, as owners, people who are selling practices, you have a choice to make, which is, do I need to get the most money I can for my retirement, for my kids, for my family? And nobody's going to blame you for that. That is kind of the reality. And if that is true, you are most likely going to be able to get the most money possible from some of these larger groups. I think it's important for those people as you're selling those is to read the fine print. Like, how long are you stuck? You certainly in today's environment want to be very careful about how much of your purchase price is in cash now versus you only get this if your practice does a certain way later. That is going to be a less good deal for you. And so like being really careful and thoughtful about that negotiation is certainly one way to go. I think if it's really important to you to provide for your clients, if you view your practice as your baby, you want to start thinking about your exit way before you exit and think about how do you get associates in and trained to take over from you. And that's what veterinarians have done for years and years, but it's likely not going to be the same money. And it doesn't always work out in that way either. Like I've certainly known people who've sold their practices to other practitioners and the practice isn't the same as what they had hoped. So, lots of different ways to think about it. We're doing something different. It is very hard to sell a specialty practice to your associates, especially when you're on a very rapid growth trajectory. Our goal is to become what's called an employee stock option plan owned practice. That is a federally recognized and actually tax supported way to sell to your employees. There is a lot of kind of legal and structural things that you have to do in order to make that a reality. We are hoping very much that we've done the right groundwork to make that happen. But there is a great practice down in Arizona who successfully sold 100% to an employee stock option plan. There's some veterinary practices that are looking at co-ops, at least 2 or 3 that I know of who have followed that worker co-op model. So there are some interesting things veterinarians are doing to look at other ways to exit.
Yeah, so if you, as a listener, were a little confused by some of those terms like cash flowing and those sorts of things, please check out iveterinarians.org. We have a number of previous episodes where we dig into financials, accounting, even lending, and what cash flowing means. So check us out there. And I'm going to plug it. I hope you're not overwhelmed. If you have a question for Dr. Davidow, the awesome thing is you can connect with her on VIN. And she can help connect you as you're sorting through some of these fabulous creative ways of making sure that the profession stays veterinarian owned. So I'm going to back up again. I'm going to go in a different direction. I've talked to a number of veterinarians who have sold. It seems like I'm hearing this story more often. It's a product of the times that we're having younger veterinarians who've built a practice and sold it. They're not ready for retirement. And now they're kind of scratching their head and thinking, now what do I do with my career? Right. So kind of walk me through like what that felt like, what that journey was like what advice do you have for those veterinarians who've sold a practice and now are like, now what do I do?
Yeah, I guess I have a number of different things. I think one of the things we don't do well enough in veterinary medicine is try to give people the opportunity to have almost like a sabbatical. And I would say that what it felt like to me when I sold was I've got a bit of a sabbatical time to step back, sort of take a pause, really think about what do I want to do next? And, how different would our profession feel if you could like academics, you work really hard for 7 years and then you get some kind of break to just regroup and think about what you want to do next. And what I ended up doing, it took me a long time to leave that practice. That practice was my baby. And I finally, decided I just really have to leave. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. I actually didn't think I was going to still be a veterinarian. I thought I was going to do some other things. And then I really missed pets. I missed being a critical care specialist. I missed doing ER. I missed being in a practice. I think there's quite a lot of people who end up selling practices and then they do relief, they do volunteer work, they buy another practice. I'm not the only one who started more than one practice. I think, again, the beauty about being a veterinarian is there's lots of different ways to use your skill set and to give back. I think that if you've owned a practice before, the business knowledge you have, if there's some way you can share that with a vet school chapter of Veterinary Business Management Association, that you could look at Small Business Association. They have a group called SCORE that provides business advisors for small businesses. I think this idea of those of us who've done it, sold practices, how do you give back and help, I think is really important.
Yeah, no, I really love what you have to say, and really to dig deep and maybe a little bit of TMI. I've kind of talked to folks who've sold and did very, very well financially. So veterinarians who've really prospered and successfully sold and exited a practice. And I almost feel like there's a little bit of guilt and defensiveness in that they've prospered and done well through that sale. And I just hope everybody feels very good and secure, and that that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to make money and be successful so you can take care of your team and you can take care of yourself and your pets, right? Your dogs and your cats and your horses, they all need to be taken care of too.
Yeah.
So another thing I'd really like to dig into, as much as you feel comfortable, is, I've heard a number of folks who are working out their commitment, or maybe their sentence, to corporate after they've sold. What kind of advice might you have for a veterinarian who's in the middle of that contract, really needs to stick it out in a scenario that doesn't work for them? Their practice is changing. They're now in a large group. At one point they were completely in control, and now they are no longer in control. How do they survive that environment, so they can really, do the right thing?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is planning at the beginning. I think I would say to most veterinary owners, when you sell your practice, you want the amount of time you have to stay after the sale to be as short as possible. And so I think a lot of my advice has to be like how you negotiate your sales contract makes a big influence on what happens and how you feel afterwards. I think, I ended up leaving early. I left money on the table because I just couldn't do it. And I think being like sort of realizing, what are you going to leave on the table? What does it mean to you? Are you willing to walk away? Are you not willing to walk away? Is important things to think about before you put your name on that piece of paper. Once you're in that situation, I think you're going to have to separate in some ways, realize it's not mine anymore. I made the decision, and the more you can use all your vacation that you've got, you give up responsibility, you sort of say, I'm going to work hard while I'm here, but I'm just not in the building. The more you can separate yourself out of the day to day, the easier it's going to be. And that is way easier said than done in those situations.
And what I hope that all of our colleagues in veterinary medicine can really take to heart, no matter where you work, is this idea is you've got to have multiple selves or multiple lives, right? Because it's great. That's what got us through vet school. That's what got us to become practice owners or where we're at today. But no matter how successful, how happy you are in your job and your career, you have to garden and pet your cats and go for walks and teach others and travel the world and develop those relationships, because otherwise you kind of get pretty wound around some bad things, and some really bad mental health issues can pop up.
And then I guess one thing I would say is that not everybody's sales experience is the same. And I think that, there are some corporations that are more hands off. There are some groups that end up being a better cultural fit. I think, thinking really carefully about what you're looking for. We thought we were really careful. We just didn't realize we were in a moment of transition. I do, and this is going to be unpopular to say, I think it's very different if you are male and 60 and selling your practice versus whether you're female and 40, because most of the people who are running private equity groups are not women, and what they're looking for, they don't always trust you. to understand your practice. Their goals and their ethics and their values might be different than yours. And there is gender at play. Like I thought for a long time, no, I'm just imagining this. This isn't really because I'm female. And then I was like, no, actually it really is. Like I'm just not being listened to because I'm female right now. And I think acknowledging that that might happen is really important.
Yeah, I've been very, very lucky in my career in that I've been able to break through a little bit of the glass ceiling, and the way men play the game of business is very different than the way women play the game of business. And so you really have to understand what's happening around you and really almost uh, rise above it in order to be in control of the situation. So really, there's a couple books out there. I think Hardball for Woman was one that I read that was really, really well done, based a lot on research. Something as simple as, men and women, how they view cheating in the game of business, right? Men think it's all fair play. It's as long as I can get the end goal, the means justify, as long as as long as I'm not doing anything illegal. Whereas women, we like to take care of each other. We like to play fairly. We like to be on a level playing field. So what has helped me a lot is really learning how we act very different culturally between the sexes. How have you been able to learn and navigate that?
Well, I think lots of different things. I mean, one is that there's like lots of great people out there. And I think some of the things that happen are totally unintentional. And I don't think, like, I just don't want any of my statements to be like, people intentionally are not listening to you. People don't realize the way they're discounting what you say in some situations because it's hard to understand exactly what it is. I also think that in terms of veterinary medicine, for a long time, although I think this is getting better, is that women did not think they could be owners and have families. And I think one of the books I like the most for women for coaching is a book that's called Playing Big. And it basically talks about how do you, as a woman, take what you really believe and you really want and be really willing to own it and to say, this is what I want and really stand behind it because we are sometimes socialized not to really believe what our biggest selves could be. And so that's one of my favorite books for women is to say, hey, you can do this. And, I would say, I want to go back a little bit to like, what do you do when you leave is one of the things I realize is when you go back and you think about all these people I offered ownership to who didn't take it, many of those people now own practices. And so a lot of the things you teach as you own a practice about why it's important to own practices, people aren't going to listen to you in real time. But 5 years later, they're going to go, oh, I should have taken her up on that. Maybe I'm going to do it a different way. And so one of the very most rewarding things to me right now is the number of people I know who were employees with me who now own practices and how important that is for veterinarians to control veterinary medicine.
Yeah, and you're getting me fired in so many different directions,
Right?
Davidow, right? Like I have so many things going on in my head. But one of the things I think really is very interesting based on my experience is to understand how men and women are both equally good at being practice owners and business people. I know that for a fact because I am a woman. I look at you and your success and all the other successful women veterinary practice owners out there. But what I've learned is how they approach becoming profitable is very different. I had an experience where through my years as a technical services veterinarian, we offered a spa day to successful practice owners. Didn't matter. You could be male, female, but we were going to go for a spa day and talk about business stuff. Then we offered Top Golf. Again, men or women. A lot more men chose Top Golf for us to have a conversation around business. Mostly women, I think it was all women, chose the spa day. And, with the men at the Top Golf, I dug in. This is how we're going to make more money. How do we do it? We're going to charge more. We're going to do this, do that. And then I tried to take that same approach with my female colleagues. And I'm like, this is how we're going to make more money. And they're like, whoa, Bonnie, no, that's not how we approach business. They approached business that if they took care of the relationship with the client and they took care of the relationship with the pet, the money would follow. And so my point behind that is that we're all good at this. We just kind of communicate differently and we might approach the problem a little bit different. So like you said, having patience.
Yeah, and I think though that there is a little bit of for women also saying, you know what, you actually do deserve this. So I lectured to the Washington State students, and so AVMA has some actually interesting statistics. Their economic report every year is very, very good to read. And one of the statistics they now have is the gender difference in what people are making, both as brand new veterinarians, but also early career, mid career, and late career. And this year they've actually published what do practice owners make who are either female or male. And male owners make at early stages almost $100,000 more than women do in as practice owners. And I think that's a really interesting statistic that we should as a profession dive into, because the question is it because women are making different choices in terms of how they run practices? So a lot of women decide to own a practice because they can then work part-time, that they can run it however they want, that they can maybe not have it open as many hours. But I think sometimes women are leaving money on the table. And so I think we also need to be a little bit careful about saying, men want to make lots of profit, women don't, because women should want to make a good profit margin as well. And I do think that one of the things I've learned as I've done this longer and longer is if you do not care about your profit margin, you will not be able to sell your practice. And if you do not care about your profit margin, you will not be able to pay your employees what you want. And so I think there is a little bit of socialization that is also around, saying it's okay to be female and make a lot of money, and that we should be encouraging people to want to do that, while at the same time saying we should all want to take care of our employees because they're not going to stay if you don't. And we all need to be able to buy new equipment or we can't provide the care we want to provide.
Absolutely. And, Dr. Beth, we've had a number of guests on who really approach profitability and what they individually want out of practice ownership very, very differently. So I'd encourage our guests to take a look at Dr. Mark Helfat's interview, as well as Dr. Arnie Goldman, talking about no-low practices and what that means, as well as seeking, maximum profits. What I, as a small business owner, would encourage every practice owner to think about is that it really is best to maximize your profits when you can, ethically, of course. We're not gouging, we're not taking advantage of anybody, but having that money in the bank, because you never know what's going to happen. You never know when the air conditioner is going to break, when you're going to, lose an associate, when you're going to have to replace the roof. You yourself might have a health issue. And so profit is not a bad word. It's money that needs to go in the bank if you've got extra to do. It's not about excess. It's about being good stewards of our profession. And you make a good point. If we paid our team better, we'd have more team members stay, and then we'd have a better quality of life.
Yeah, and better care for pets. I mean, I think one of the things, especially in ER, like if I don't have good nurses, I can't do my job. And, certainly I think as a business owner, you have to think about like, what's most important to me? What does it mean to do my job well? And if those things are important to me, where am I going to dedicate my resources and my funds? And so you make different decisions about what your profit and loss statement looks like. You can get the same amount of profit by deciding to do things a little bit differently, depending on what matters to you.
Absolutely. And so again, it's being mindful, thoughtful, forward thinking, planning, all those good things. So, you said an interesting statement that I hear it's becoming a common theme across our profession, which is we should really own our profession, right? So veterinarians should own our medicine. We should own our profession. So what does that mean to you that veterinarians should own the profession? And how does how are we going to manage to own the profession if fewer of us are actually owning practices? So how do we become leaders in our profession and make sure medicine stays at the center?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think some of it comes from people who've owned practices being really mindful about being mentors for veterinary students. I think supporting groups like Veterinary Business Association, Management Association makes a lot of sense. I think we need to encourage AVMA to really look carefully at how we make sure veterinary voices are at the center. I think there's a lot of state laws that at some point we need to sit down and as a profession really look at. So in Washington state, it is easier for me to sell my practice to a corporation than it is to allow my veterinary practice manager to have a stake in my business. And that's a problem because I think that if we think about veterinary professionals and who owns the practices, it's not just veterinarians we'd like to have ownership in, it's our veterinary practice managers and our technicians. Like, think about how life-changing it is if you are a technician and you can own a practice. And that is very true in some states and not at all true in Washington state. So Washington state's law was developed and planned to try to protect veterinary voices at the center. But because of the way it was designed, it's made it very, very easy for corporations to come in and own practices. And they do not have to have a veterinary voice at the center because it's too easy to do a runaround. I think looking at this idea of what would happen if we required every veterinary practice group to actually have a chief medical officer. And you would think that every veterinary group would currently have a chief veterinary medical officer, but they don't. A lot of them do not have to have a person who sits in the C-suite who represents veterinarians. Almost none of them have a chief veterinary nursing officer. VEG is actually the only corporation that has a veterinary technician in their C-suite. And that's a problem that AVMA could start really talking about to keep veterinary voices at the center is how do we say, you know what, you actually cannot own veterinary practices if you don't have these people in your C-suites. And who's in your C-suite matters. It just does. Like, we know this. Who does this? How do we do this? What is the voice that AVMA has? I think that's important for us to sit down and really talk about.
So again, hope I don't overwhelm you, but if you have lots of creative questions for Dr. Davidow, please reach out to her on Vin. She's a great resource and obviously has tons of experience with some of these sticky situations and some creative ways for working through those. But I think it's wonderful. And please, I love your blog, even though I know you haven't had time to keep it as current as you would like. There's a lot of really good historical perspective in your blog. I think it's the veterinaryidealist.com.
Yep. Yeah. Vetidealist.com. The Veterinary Idealist is sort of the name of the blog. And I do have like quite a lot of posts around some of the things we're talking about, some information about if you're talking about having a partner in ownership, which I totally think is worthwhile to do. Partnerships are like marriages. And so you better know who you're getting into bed with. And so I have some questions that somebody else helped me with about how to really sit down with whoever's going to be your partner and talk about these things that matter to you. There are some other information about what the profession looks like and challenges around ownership and really setting out who you want to be.
So, Dr. Davidow, what gives you hope about the future of veterinary medicine? Because I think we're at a great spot, and I think it's actually really hopeful. The future is really hopeful. So what do you think is good? What do you think is going to happen in the future that's going to be good?
Well, I mean, I think the bottom line is people love their pets. And I think pets are a big part of people's families. They bring everybody lots of joy and lots of kind of meaning. And so I think we as veterinarians are in a really good place to support something that's super like good for everyone. And so I think like when things are hard and things are tough, just remembering like what we do is super important, I think gives me hope. I think the other thing that gives me hope is just, as I said before, watching a bunch of people who are younger than me, who I got the ability to work with, who now own their own practices that are doing fantastic. Like that is super fun to watch, and just realizing that, we should be encouraging people to start up practices, buy practices, own practices. And then we should be willing to talk to people about, how do you do it? Like, how do you be a mom or a dad and a business owner? How do you leverage so that you're using the support of other people who want to support veterinarians? I guess I'll just make this one plug right now. One of the things I hear from veterinarians is, I don't want to do HR. I don't want to do finance. Therefore, I had to sell my practice. Well, I am super lucky in that I just hired somebody who does all my finance and payroll and stuff for me. And he's fantastic. He's worked with me both in my previous practice and this practice. They don't have to be your boss. They can be somebody who works with you as your partner. And so I think veterinarians need to realize it's okay to hire people to support you. You don't have to sell to get that support.
That's a great thought. The idea that what I've heard you say over the last hour or so is this idea that we need to be creative, we need to support each other, and that there's a lot of hope. So, all right, if you could sum it up in just one sentence for young veterinarians and why they should buy or start a practice, what would you tell them?
I would say veterinarians should control veterinary medicine. I think that's sort of the bottom line. You'll have more fun. This isn't one sentence, but the AVMA statistics on well-being show that practice owners have much higher well-being scores than associates do. And so, yes, it's hard work, but well-being doesn't always mean that you have your feet up. Well-being is about doing something that brings you purpose and meaning. And it's super fun to get to control your own practice.
Yeah, autonomy is very powerful. Being able to manage your own life and your medicine, and choosing what's important to you and what brings you purpose.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, Dr. Davidow, it has been so good talking to you today. Again, check her out, thevetidealist.com. Follow her on LinkedIn if you're looking for a job. I noticed you occasionally post openings. So if you love her leadership and you're in the Seattle area, make sure you follow her on LinkedIn. And then really, she's there to help as a consultant on VIN, which does a great job with the Startup Club, I believe. So lots and lots of resources. If you'd like to learn more, if you maybe missed out on some of the terms we used, check us out at iveterinarians.org. Lots of previous podcasts of experts. And I'm so glad and thankful you could join us today, Dr. Davidow.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed our conversation.